Paul to introduce Jeff. Paul.
Thanks, Keith. Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening. People in the UK, people in North America, and Gabriella from Sweden, I notice on the list as well, which is great to see. Yeah, Jeff, as many of you will know, is a trustee of the Society and has been a regular contributor to our newsletter over the years. He'll be talking to us from Austin, Texas, which is great. And we'll be talking to us about Anthony Powell and Malcolm Muggeridge. So over to you, Jeff.
Right. I think I'll just start right in here. We're all familiar with Malcolm Muggeridge's surprising dismissal of Anthony Powell's Dance to the Music of Time in a 1964 review. This related to the seventh novel, Belly of Bones. It was, so far as I know, the only review Muggeridge had written of any Powell novel up to that point. I hope you have had an opportunity to read it recently, since we distributed it before the date. And so I do not intend to discuss the early passages in detail. It seems to me to begin as a reasonable enough discussion of the new volume in the context of the entire series. Then, toward the end, Muggeridge begins to compare the book to Evelyn Waugh's recently completed war trilogy, Sword of Honor. He finds that the principal difference between the two works relates to the nature of the narrators and their distinct forms of what Muggeridge describes as snobbishness. That argument doesn't make a lot of sense, and it's unclear to whom Muggeridge is referring to as Waugh's narrator. But it may be the case that Muggeridge was attempting to argue that Waugh and Powell themselves, as well as their novels, evidenced a form of snobbishness. Muggeridge had a long and troubled relationship with Waugh, who was still among the living in 1964. As I will discuss, it is possible that this relationship may itself have contributed indirectly to the review's negative conclusions, which I will now read to you. Stendhal, one of Mr. Powell's major admirations, prophesied that posterity would enjoy and appreciate his work, neglected by his contemporaries. The prophecy has been abundantly fulfilled. We, Mr. Powell's contemporaries, have proved less recalcitrant and have done him proud. Will posterity be correspondingly less amenable? See in his meticulous reconstruction of his life and times a heap of dust? Despite a strong personal partiality, honesty compels me to admit that it might. That conclusion was certainly surprising and inconsistent with the more thoughtful discussion that preceded it. It may have been hinted at in charges of snobbishness, but Powell could certainly have taken those into stride. Instead, he was confronted with a dismissal of his major work by a close friend and collaborator. He concluded from this that Muggeridge wished to end their relationship or friendship. But what was his motivation? About a year after the review appeared, Muggeridge seems to have tried to make amends by inviting Powell to appear on a BBC TV interview program called Intimations. What I propose to do is consider, one, what it was in Muggeridge's history that may have caused him to make such a gratuitously hurtful comment about the words of an old friend. Two, whether he consciously intended it to end their friendship, as Powell seems inclined to believe. And three, whether the BBC interview and Muggeridge's subsequent actions went any meaningful way toward patching things up. Muggeridge was raised in a family of socialists in the Croydon area. His father worked his way up in a clothing manufacturer to the position of corporate secretary and was also a Labour MP. So perhaps, somewhat like George Orwell, Muggeridge was lower middle class. Malcolm did well enough in the local state grammar school to gain entrance to Cambridge. While a student at Selwyn College, he earned a pass degree in natural science in 1924. He enjoyed college life, but not studies. Although he remained a socialist, he was also baptized while he was at Cambridge. He began his career as a teacher, first in India, then Birmingham, where he was married in 1927, and finally Egypt, where he began writing freelance articles for the English papers. These led to a position as leader writer at the Manchester Guardian in 1930. That afforded him the opportunity to take up a position as the Guardian's Moscow correspondent in 1932. As it turned out, after he and his wife arrived, his predecessor decided to stay on. So Muggeridge used the time to travel around the country and witnessed firsthand the disastrous consequences that the collectivization of agriculture and other communist policies were having. When he tried to get his stories about that published, the liberal Guardian altered respite them. After 9 months, Malcolm left Russia and the Guardian. He joined his wife in Switzerland, where she had been managing a socialist-sponsored hostel after having been medevaced from Russia during her pregnancy. He later wrote reports for the ILO, International Labour Organization, in Geneva, and then found a job with the Calcutta Statesman in 1934. When he returned to London from that in 1937, he worked for the Evening Standard and then for the Daily Telegraph. During these years, he was also writing books, and with surprisingly little difficulty found publishers for 7: a play, 4 novels by his definition of novel, a literary biography, and a current history. I will briefly discuss each of these. Before he left for Russia, he'd written a play called 3 Flats and got it produced in the West End in early 1931. It seems to have done well, or at least got good reviews. He wrote another and several others over the years, but no more ever was produced professionally. The play was published as a book by G.P. Putnam, and based on the storytelling skills it evidenced, Putnam encouraged Muggeridge to write a novel. He did that, and later that same year, it was published. This was called Autumnal Face, about a family in Croydon. It was published by Putnam as promised in late 1931, but was not well received. In fact, I think they may have done him a favor if they had denied his publication. His writing skills were acknowledged, but according to L.P. Hartley, it was the most depressing book he ever read. It was never reprinted. He also wrote a novel about his experiences at the Guardian. Oh, sorry. After his assignment in Russia, he turned his experience into a book entitled Winter in Moscow. He called the book a novel to protect against libel suits. In it, he reported how Western correspondents, visiting politicians, and others were being duped and were naively reporting glowing stories of the successes of the Soviet economy and the general well-being of the people. The book reported things as he saw them in person and was generally well received, although not among many socialists who preferred not to read about Soviet excesses. An American edition was also published. The book's success helped establish his credibility as a journalist, but was not reprinted, probably due to its unpopularity with leftists. He also wrote a novel about his experiences at the Guardian. This was called Picture Palace. It was a traditional workplace novel, but some of the characters were easily identifiable, as was the workplace itself. When the Guardian threatened legal action, the publisher withdrew it. It was eventually published in the 1980s, but by then its moment had passed. He was also commissioned by Jonathan Cape to write a biography of Samuel F. Butler for that novelist's centenary in 1938. What he wrote was so negative and dwelt so heavily on Butler's associations with homosexuals that Cape refused to publish it. But he had no problem finding another publisher. E&S put it out, and there was a US edition, but it was not reprinted until after the war. Probably his most successful work of so-called fiction was In a Valley of This Restless Mind, Although he called it a novel, it was mostly a fictionalized memoir of his spiritual journey among various religious figures in the 1930s. It has no plot to speak of, nor are the characters developed beyond identifying their religious credentials. Muggeridge says the book confused the critics and was largely ignored. But it did find a booster in the person of Evelyn Waugh. Writing in The Spectator, Waugh thought the book most importantly to be a, quote, highly unusual and welcome piece of workmanship. He concluded that in the next 10 years, we shall see a number of imitators, but it is too much to hope that we will see as many as well written, end quote. Restless Mind, despite its muted reception among the critics, has remained popular to this day and was reprinted in both the US and the UK. Now, this was probably his most successful book commercially. It's a history of the 30s, which he wrote in 1940, just as the war was beginning. It was also published in America and was later reprinted and turned into a BBC documentary after the war. It's highly readable even today. It has not dated, despite the fact it was written in 1940. Here's a score sheet of the novels he wrote in the 1930s. And it seems to me a fairly impressive list. Writing his memoirs in the early 1970s, he describes with hindsight being confronted at the end of the 1930s with a choice. His play in at least 3 of his pre-war books have been critical and commercial successes. That would be Winter in Moscow, Restless Mind, and the 30s. The only real failure was Autumnal Face. He needed to decide, he says, whether to become what he called a man of letters, i.e. a professional writer, depending primarily on the writing of books, or a journalist on the staff of a newspaper. There's more about this in my written version, but for now, it seems sufficient to say that he could think of no family or financial reason for choosing writing over journalism. And he says that he never really gave a writer's life option a serious choice. And indeed, after the war, he was primarily a journalist, editor, or broadcast personality. His post-war books are mostly collections of journalism, memoirs, or religious tracts. There was one exception, which may be relevant to our topic today, but more of that in a moment. Now let's move on to his friendship with Anthony Powell. Muggeridge and Powell had met shortly before the war. Powell describes the meeting in his memoirs. He arrived in Sussex on a visit to Gerald Reitlinger, probably in late 1938. And on the way from the station, Reitlinger stopped unannounced at the Muggeridge house. Reitlinger was already well acquainted with Muggeridge. As described in Powell's memoirs, they arrived to much confusion in a house overrun with children. And Muggeridge took the Reitlinger-Powell party upstairs, quote, for a talk. At the time, Powell was aware of Muggeridge's work on Soviet Russia, but not his status as a rising man in Fleet Street circles. Muggeridge was at this point working at the Daily Telegraph as a leader writer and book reviewer. Restless Mind may have recently been published or was about to be, but Powell doesn't seem to have been aware of it. The meeting went well, and after that, they saw quite a lot of each other. During the war, Muggeridge had a career quite like Graham Greene's, first at the Ministry of Information, and then espionage in Africa for MI6. Unlike Greene, however, he didn't use his wartime experiences to write books. His most interesting escapade was probably his opportunity to help P.G. Wodehouse escape arrest for treason in France. He did eat out on that experience in numerous articles and broadcasts. During the war, he would occasionally meet with Powell in London, where they might also see George Orwell, with whom they had both independently become friends during the war. After the war in early 1946, Muggeridge was godfather to Powell's second son, John, who possesses a book given to his parents on the occasion of his baptism. This is, somewhat ironically for a christening present, a copy of The Earnest Atheist. Muggeridge secured an undemanding post-war job at the Daily Telegraph and dabbled in book publishing as a talent scout for Iron Spottiswoode, where Graham Greene was also working. He and Powell and Greene met regularly for lunch at the Authors Club. Muggeridge had suggested that Powell take his John Aubrey book, which he began writing after the war, to Iron Spottiswoode, and was present at the luncheon meeting with Greene, where Powell complained about the 2.5-year delay in the book's publication. The book was finally published in late 1948, after Greene had been sacked or resigned, and the book is dedicated to Malcolm. Muggeridge was for a time Daily Telegraph correspondent in Washington. When he returned, he moved into a flat quite near where Powell lived in Regent's Park. That's this house over here. Powell's entrance is behind that car. Muggeridge lived at 5 Cambridge Gate, just around the corner from Powell. This was the period when Powell was fiction editor at TLS while conceiving the plan for the dance and writing The Question of Upbringing. As you can see from this map, they were quite close. Chestergate is right here. Muggeridge is around the corner here. This was their period of their most frequent contact and collaboration. Powell recalls they would discuss the dance project on long walks in the park, which is right over here. He would read Muggeridge bits of the book as it was being written. Muggeridge mentions in his diaries being favorably impressed with the book as it progressed. Powell also read and commented favorably on a novel Muggeridge had written after he got back from America. That was Affairs of the Heart, published in 1949. It was an unambitious attempt at writing a thriller in the tradition of Graham Greene's entertainments. It is also a satire of book publishing. It succeeds at neither satire nor mystery, as Muggeridge himself concedes. Evelyn Waugh also reviewed this book and dismissed it as light reading by a writer who 12 years ago gave promise of deeper interests. Powell also reviewed the book in TLS. He placed it within the tradition of good stories about authors in the literary world. His only reservation was that the climax was not quite powerful enough to support the energy and high spirits of the place and character. In fact, the climax virtually doesn't exist, which Muggeridge later said was part of the satire, because he intended to, let the reader down instead of giving him an exciting ending. But that didn't work. In any event, it was Muggeridge's last attempt at fiction. It was not reprinted, and a US edition did not appear until 12 years later. Muggeridge had meantime become a headhunter, a consultant for the book publisher Heinemann, in addition to his work for the Daily Telegraph. When Powell had finished Question of Upbringing, Muggeridge recommended that he take the novel to Heinemann when it was ready. In fact, Muggeridge himself personally delivered the finished draft to Heinemann's offices. In this period, Muggeridge was advancing at the Daily Telegraph and beginning to appear regularly on BBC radio programs. When Muggeridge was hired as editor of Punch in late 1952, he invited Powell to become literary editor, and he followed the next year. That was just after the first 2 volumes of Dance had been published, and the Powells had moved the country. Muggeridge's editorial experience at the State Humor magazine was a somewhat rocky one, but he was also expanding his participation in broadcast journalism. Neither of the 2 friends writes much about the other during the tenure at Punch, but their relations with Evelyn Waugh during this period developed in a manner that I think may have contributed to the 1964 bust-up. Muggeridge and Waugh had first met in person in 1944 at a dinner party at Duff Gordon's residence in Algiers during the war. Muggeridge had never properly thanked Wall for or discussed with him his favorable review of Restless Mind in the 30s, despite the fact that Wall was one of the few established critics to proclaim that book's brilliance. But when they met, Muggeridge was reluctant to engage in any discussion about the book, out of fear that Wall would turn on him and try to make him look foolish. He seems to have been genuinely afraid of Wall's notorious temper and snobbery. Several years later, Wall appeared to try to make nice when Muggeridge became editor at Punch. Muggeridge recalls that Wall sent him a bread and butter letter expressing his best wishes on the appointment. Wall also suggested that he would like to contribute to the newly redirected magazine in support of Muggeridge's efforts to revive it. I was able to find 2 or 3 attempts by Wall to publish in the New Punch, but they were rebuffed by Muggeridge rather than encouraged. One of those was an article he proposed to Muggeridge on Tito's state visit to the UK in 1954. Muggeridge immediately answered by wire saying, yes, let's go, write it. Wall sent it in, only to have Muggeridge tell him that he would have to wait until the state visit had ended before he published it. So Wall said, send it back. The second one was in 1957, when Wall was being pursued by an aggressive Daily Express journalist named Nancy Spain for an interview. And she actually walked on to Wall's house and grounds, passing his do not enter except on business sign with a colleague named Noel Buxton. They went to the door and said, can we interview you? He was furious. So he proposed to Muggeridge that he write an article about this, which he duly sent in. And Muggeridge sent it back saying he's sorry he couldn't publish, it's libelous. Wall then marked it up a bit, sent it to the Spectator, and it was published quite quickly as Awake My Soul, It Is a Lord, one of his best pieces of journalism. While Wall was unsuccessfully pursuing publication in Punch, both Wall and Muggeridge were each separately communicating to Powell suggestions of misbehavior by the other. These included, for example, notes from Wall questioning the bona fides of Muggeridge's membership in Pratt's Club, and communications from Muggeridge to Powell noting Wall's drunken behavior at that same institution. Powell was in an awkward position. Muggeridge would have been well aware of Powell's reestablishment of more amicable contacts with Wall after Powell moved to the country in the early 1950s, and he probably resented that. But if Muggeridge ever expressed his annoyance to Powell, Powell never mentions it. There followed the enmity between Muggeridge and Wall came to a head in July 1957, when Muggeridge was scheduled to speak at a Foyles luncheon intended as a book launch for Wall's novel, Gilbert Pinfold. Here's how Muggeridge described what happened. I was chairman, Wall was there, and it was when he was never without an enormous old-fashioned ear trumpet. I don't think he was in the least deaf, actually. As I got up and cleared my throat to undertake the grisly ordeal of making a speech, he very ostentatiously took the trumpet out of his ear and put it on the desk in front of him. This caused an enormous laugh, which gave me a difficult start. According to Muggeridge, this turned his intended homage into a meandering, facetious discourse and embarrassed him in front of his assembled literary peers. Stories about Wall's ill manners at Muggeridge's expense appeared in several of the national papers. Shortly after the Foyles incident, Muggeridge left Punch at the conclusion of his 5-year contract, and Powell followed at the end of the next year, 1958. Powell ended up with a position as book review editor at the Daily Telegraph, so his work schedule probably remained much as before. Muggeridge, on the other hand, took the opportunity to launch his broadcast career in earnest, with regular appearances on the BBC. and was soon established as an early version of what came to be called a TV celebrity. He also continued his journalistic career as a freelance reporter and essayist. In late 1957, however, he dropped a clanger with a rather too personal and negative assessment of the royal family, at least as depicted in the British press. This turned into the royal soap opera scandal, as it became called. The article was scheduled for publication in the Saturday Evening Post to coincide with a royal visit to America. It was entitled, as you see here, "Does England Really Need a Queen?" That was not Muggeridge's choice. And unfortunately, before it was published, it was leaked to the British press. There followed a pre-publication London tabloid feeding frenzy. When the dust had settled, Muggeridge was sacked by the BBC and several of his journalistic venues, and thought it might be a good time for some foreign travel. He spent about a year overseas, starting in Australia. He kept up his journalism during this period. As you see, he visited some fairly interesting places along the way. And in Australia, he actually did some TV work. When he got back to England in 1959, he was still barred by the BBC, however, and he managed to organize a regular interview program and other appearances on Grenada for ITV broadcast. But about a year after he got back, the BBC, under a new director, Hugh Green, who was Graham's brother, reopened access to their facilities. He was now writing, as well as appearing and presenting on TV. He was also drinking heavily and making unwanted passes at women, becoming known at the BBC as the Pouncer. He returned to print journalism as well, including a regular book review gig at the Evening Standard. He and Powell remained on good terms in this period, but would have been in less frequent contact than in the early post-war years when they were neighbors in Regent's Park and later co-workers at Punch. The royal soap opera affair may actually have had some negative effect on Muggeridge's 1964 review, at least according to Violet Powell. A shorter version had originally appeared 2 years earlier in the New Statesman under the soap opera heading. Muggeridge was at that time still at Punch. The primary message of that article was that the royal family needed professional and experienced PR personnel to take charge of arranging their meetings with the press. The couturiers they principally relied upon were simply not up to the task of effectively dealing with hard-nosed journalists. This more focused article got hardly any attention, except for some grousing in the Beaverbrook press. Muggeridge had apparently told the Pauls of his intention to reprint the expanded article, which got beyond just public relations, in the Saturday Evening Post. Lady Violet thought that AP should have warned Muggeridge against US publication. Perhaps more importantly, she thinks Muggeridge may have resented the fact that AP failed to speak out in Muggeridge's defense during the period of his banishment from the UK press and broadcast media. Powell rejected her position on the basis that Muggeridge knew that their views on the monarchy differed. But I wonder if Lady Violet, who was able to look at the matter more objectively, may not have identified a genuine source of Muggeridge's resentment. And surely Powell did not think that the punishment of being barred from the British media fit the crime of critically depicting the royal family's press coverage. Ironically, Muggeridge was quite right about the royal soap opera, as later events have only too graphically proven. At about the time Muggeridge returned to London, Evelyn Waugh reviewed Dance. He previously expressed his admiration of the books in letters to Powell, and probably in personal contacts, but this was the first time he'd written about them in the literary press. In 1960, he expressed reservations about Casanova's Chinese restaurant, largely because of its emphasis on musicians and music critics in whom he took no interest. But when The Kindly Ones came out 2 years later, he wrote an adulatory review of the whole series up to that point. That was 2 years before Malcolm Muggeridge's Valley of Bones review, but may have annoyed Muggeridge, whose last attempt at a novel had been panned by Waugh. It can't have helped Muggeridge, from Waugh's perspective, that during the 1950s and 60s, Muggeridge was carrying on a fairly open affair with Waugh's close friend and correspondent, Pamela Barry, and was a good friend and associate of Waugh's brother-in-law, Oberon Herbert, whom Waugh despised. This is discussed more in my paper, but we should be aware of this. Muggeridge's somewhat cringing animosity toward Waugh didn't end with Waugh's death in 1966. Muggeridge wrote an obituary of Waugh in The Observer, in which he updated his collection of Waugh's efforts to embarrass him. He also described his last view of Waugh in a French Riviera resort, where Muggeridge just happened to be staying with his wife at a nearby villa. This would have been in January, February 1963 in Montagne. Muggeridge saw Waugh sitting all day disconsolately in the lounge of the hotel with a book in his hand. He was tempted to make a move toward reconciliation and even drafted 2 letters proposing that they meet, but he destroyed both of them out of a, quote, cowardly fear of being repulsed or made to look foolish. This was a missed opportunity because, as it turned out, Waugh was sitting there staring ahead because he had writer's block. The idea was to take him to Montagne where he wouldn't be distracted. He sat there for 2 or 3 weeks and wrote not a single word. So this could have been the time he was looking for someone's company and might have even accepted Muggeridge's. Muggeridge had by 1964 rebuilt and expanded his US work base and was not under any particular professional pressure. Indeed, during the 1960s, he probably reached the peak of his career in terms of productivity, exposure, and revenue. He even attained one of the ultimate perks of celebrity status, cameo roles in films, such as Peter Sellers' comedies, I'm All Right, Jack, and Heavens Above, and Jonathan Miller's film of Alice in Wonderland. In early 1964, when the bombshell of the Valley of Bones review was dropped, here's the a slide of the actual copy. Now, this copy is Powell's copy, actually, from his archive. There's much speculation about what motivated Muggeridge to write the dismissive conclusion. Muggeridge's biographer, Richard Ingrams, notes that Muggeridge gave up drinking in 1963 as one of the fallouts from his breakup with the long-term affair with Pamela Barry. Another biographer says that he quit smoking in 1964. These actions in turn may have been connected to the expansion of his more outwardly religious interest. Given the new extremist regime, Ingrams thinks that Muggeridge may have become bored with friends such as Powell, who no longer shared his drinking habits or his new religious interest. Hilary Sperling makes a similar comment. These may well have been contributing factors to the negativity. We already mentioned Lady Powell's Royal Opera mention. Powell and his biographers, on the other hand, as well as those of Muggeridge, generally conclude that the negativity in the review was a case of Malcolm's jealousy of Powell's success as a novelist, a form of writing Muggeridge never really mastered. In 1964, he'd already reached the top tier in print journalism and TV, but for an egotist in Muggeridge's league, you can perhaps never have enough success. There may well have been a lingering grudge that he had failed where Powell succeeded, but I think his grievance was more complicated than mere professional jealousy over novel writings. The biographers seem to think that Malcolm was so self-centered that he didn't even give any thought to the hurtfulness the review would cause to a close friend. It simply would not have occurred to him. For example, he had written the review at almost the same time that he arranged with Powell's to make a visit to them that was scheduled to take place the weekend after the review was published. That meeting didn't take place. There may be an element of truth in his having been an unplanned or offhand remark, but at the time he wrote those words, he must surely have realized that that last paragraph was not going to be well received. Let's skip that. For his part, writing in his journals nearly 30 years later, Powell had become convinced that what put Muggeridge over the top and caused a sudden burst of rage, manifesting itself in the negative conclusion, was the material printed on his own novel's dust wrapper. Powell notes that in the review, Malcolm had remarked how Powell's, quote, contemporaries have done him proud, as witnessed apparently by the acclaim, Powell's word, from those contemporaries on the back cover. These look to me like the usual blurbs from the New York Times, Kingsley Amis, L.P. Hartley, and so forth. But AP thinks that, inoffensive as they may appear, to Muggeridge, they could have been incendiary. Powell was obviously very close to Muggeridge and would have known and understood how his mind worked and how his temper manifested itself. So I think his conclusion is entitled to considerable weight. But I think that there may be another and more subtle element of jealousy that was motivating Muggeridge in this dismissive conclusion. That arises from his complex and rather odd attitude toward Evelyn Waugh. It is at least possible that Muggeridge's abrupt dismissal of Powell's work in the 1964 review was influenced to some extent by his jealousy of Powell's ability to get along with Waugh and keep him on friendly terms, but at arm's length. That was something Muggeridge longed for, but never achieved. Powell, unlike Muggeridge, never showed any signs of sucking up to Waugh or avoiding encounters with him, but simply got on with him by overlooking rather than confronting some of his faults. Whatever may have caused the review's negativity, unlike the long-playing standoff with Waugh, Muggeridge seems to have taken the initiative to fairly quickly restore relations with Powell. In the summer of 1965, just over a year from publication of the review, Muggeridge had the BBC contact Powell to sign him up for a new interview series, which they were planning. Once Powell had agreed, Muggeridge contacted him directly by letter. I don't know whether this was their first contact since the review, a year and a half before. There's nothing of a written nature in the archives of either writer. Muggeridge's letter notes the names of others who had agreed to be interviewed in the series. Here's a complete list from the BBC's archives. The ones in red are writers of some form or another who seem clearly to dominate. Two of these interviews are actually still posted in full on the internet. It's just the ones with Graves and John Le Carre. In his letter, Malcolm explains the nature of the review series. The object is to find out what induced you and all the others to do what you've done and the way you've done it. I don't know whether you'd like to meet before October 4th, the date they were going to tape the interview. I certainly should, quite apart from the program. I hate the idea of a lost friendship finally fizzling out on the TV set. This looks like an olive branch being extended, and it's probably as close as Muggeridge came to an apology. I can't say whether or not the pre-interview meeting took place, but I suspect it did. Neither Powell nor Muggeridge mentioned the letter or the interview itself in their memoirs or diaries. What we sent around for you to view at your leisure is not the full interview. All the BBC was able to find in their archives was the film of the opening credits and the last half of the interview, starting about in the middle. If you've read it, you'll note that there is a disconnect at the very beginning where they skip to a question Muggeridge is asking Powell about how Turgenev had influenced his writing. but it is the complete interview from that point. Here's my transcription of the last bit of the interview. These are this last series of questions. And you'll note Muggeridge, I think, throws in here a hint to the Valley of Bones flap. He says, is there a flavor of sadness, which I like about the music dance? Powell sort of fumbles that and ends up saying, no, on the contrary. And Muggeridge says, is this a legitimate reaction? I think very legitimate. Well, you wouldn't object or throw me out of the studio. I think that's the reference to the review. Then at the conclusion, he asked Powell whether he can see the end of the Dance to the Music of Time. And then he explains he's written 7 and he hopes to do 12. And when Muggeridge asks, can you see them looming ahead? You can see them reaching a finale. Powell says, yes, rather like Macbeth. Now, I think what happens next year is something that Powell really doesn't discuss. Just to bring things to closure, Muggeridge became more and more taken up with religion in his last 25 years. And he wrote several books on religious themes, as well as a separate collection of essays and another of television material. So far as I can determine, the 1964 Valley of Bones review was itself never reprinted. In the New Statesman, Muggeridge also contributed a review of the last novel in the series. That's, of course, Hearing Secret Harmonies. That review appeared as A Valley of Lost Things. And here's the opening. With the publication of the last novel in Powell's A Dance to the Music of Time, the great work is now completed. Surveying it as a whole, the opinion I formed some quarter of a century ago when Powell was engaged in the opening is confirmed. I thought then, and I think more than ever now, that his picture of the contemporary scene will prove to be of lasting interest and an authentic contribution to literature. It is petty point, but wonderfully observed and above all, wonderfully funny. He doesn't mention or explain the 1964 assessment, but he wouldn't. It wouldn't be in character. Michael Barber is the only biographer of either writer who mentions this later review with any specificity. I don't think Powell himself mentions it either, but it does seem to consign the idea that dance was a dust heap into the landfill of history. Muggeridge's last published works on words on Powell may have been this entry in the Observer's Book of the Year column for 1975. I greatly enjoyed Anthony Powell's Hearing Secret Harmonies. It confirmed my high opinion of the work as a whole, which I see as a 20th century version of Guy's Beggar's Opera, the Rentier's opera. Muggeridge also published 2 volumes of his memoirs and a volume of diaries after 1964. He began work on a 3rd volume of memoirs, which is the one in which Powell would have appeared chronologically, but never produced a finished version. Powell is mentioned, but only once in the memoirs. However, he does appear frequently in the diaries for the early post-war years. Powell did not review Muggeridge's memoirs, but he did review the diaries, which were published later and entitled Like It Was. He found much that was of interest and nothing particularly to complain about, except the title, which he thought a poor choice. Muggeridge wrote a cordial letter of thanks to Powell for that review, and that letter was in turn acknowledged by Powell with equal cordiality. The Muggeridge review flap is mentioned numerous times in Powell's journals, although not, I think, in his memoirs. In the first volume, Powell describes how Richard Ingrams, editor of Private Eye and Muggeridge's official biographer, asked to interview him for the biography, with particular references to the review of Valley of Bones. That was in late 1985. Muggeridge had told Ingrams that there had been a row, but he thought the details obscure and suggested that Powell could perhaps provide those to Ingrams. Before responding to Ingrams, Powell contacted Muggeridge directly to ask if he was agreeable to Ingram's request. According to Powell, quote, Malcolm replied enthusiastically that he would like everything about himself revealed, speaking at the same time of Ingram's with unqualified admiration. Powell told Ingrams that there was nothing obscure about the review and showed him a copy. The review, this is what Powell wrote, the review, like a cabinet minister's speech on an otherwise non-political occasion, such as the Royal Academy banquet, seemed to me, still does, a declaration of policy on Malcolm's part, that he did not wish to be friends anymore. In volume 2, I should mention that this page on the other side is the cover of Private Eye from when Muggeridge was made the, I think it was honorary editor for one issue in 19, I can't quite see the date there, but that was quite an honor for Muggeridge.
Jeff, it's Paul here. You're nearly out of time, so just a reminder.
Okay. In volume 2 of the journals, Powell was bemused by what Muggeridge called his last religious book. Well, I think I'll skip that. It appears to me pretty clear that between the years of 1974, at least, and 1985, the two of them remained in contact. That appears from the correspondence in Muggeridge's archive. Muggeridge suffered a decline in health in 1985 and had a few strokes. There are several mentions in the final volume of Powell's journal, which covers the period. Well, I'll cover that later. It seems fair to say in conclusion, and something we may want to discuss, that shortly after Muggeridge's review had appeared in early 1964, third Muggeridge, Muggeridge's religious inclinations more or less took over. As Richard Ingram suggests, by that time Muggeridge wrote the review, he may have already found his contacts with Powell had become boring. The same could well be said for Powell's part about contacts with the Tito sanctimonious Muggeridge. It seems to me, at least, that even without the Valley of Bones review, their close relationship was about to come to an end as the hot gospeling Muggeridge became manifest. Frequent contacts would probably have ended pretty much as and when they did. Brief, occasional, and friendly but distant exchanges would have continued as they were needed. And that's about where things ended up in any event after the BBC interview, and remained there until Muggeridge's death in 1990. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. Last couple of slides there, if you can take your screen share down, please, Jeff. And I think we've got a little bit of time for questions. If anybody's got, I need to. Can you turn your screen share off, please, Jeff? Can I turn you off? That's better. Okay. So if you want to ask questions, then if you can raise your hand, and I see Elwyn's already in pole position. Elwyn, over to you.
Good. No, thank you. Thanks. No, just listening, and Jeff, thanks very much. Congratulations on that, which is very interesting. Listening to it, of course, I remember, if you remember Perry Anderson's talk at the Travellers Club a couple of years ago, it was, of course, on the longevity of Anthony Powell. And he then, I think, drew attention to the fact that at the, virtually the last words in the memoirs, where basically duration in time should not necessarily be the criterion in producing a work of art, and gives the example of Michelangelo building a snowman. I mean, is that him trying to get the last word in the argument, do you think? Perhaps saying, well, you may be right and it won't last very long, but it doesn't matter. I mean,
But this is Anderson, you mean?
Yeah.
No, that was Powell. Anderson cited Powell writing that in his memoirs. Longevity in a work of art actually isn't the important criterion. Those are his sort of last words in his memoirs, more or less.
Well, perhaps he was trying to make light of it, but I think it was important to him because he took that statement of Muggeridge so much to heart, and was so concerned about it.
Yes, I mean, I would think that the fact that he actually finished with those words when he wrote his memoirs indicates that it was something he thought about a lot, but maybe come to the conclusion that he didn't want to nail his colours to the mast in case Muggeridge was at and his work didn't last. I mean, he made the contention, well, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, that quote actually at the end of the memoirs is rather good, I think. I've noted it in the past. Powell says, Vasari says that on a winter day in Florence, when snow was deep on the ground, one of the Medici sent for Michelangelo to build a snowman in the courtyard of the Medici Palace. Notwithstanding those, like Constant Lambert, who dislike the High Renaissance, one can scarcely doubt that the finest snowman on record took shape, which I think is rather good. But yeah, anybody else? Paul?
Yeah, thanks, Keith. Just a couple of comments really to add, Jeff. Thanks a lot. I think on Muggeridge, I think it's just worth mentioning that when he and Kitty went to Moscow, they were so committed as socialists stroke communists that they were planning to live in the Soviet Union and stay there. So Muggeridge's bravery at exposing what was happening in the Soviet Union, I don't think can be underestimated. So to that extent, he's a very important figure, along with Orwell, with Animal Farm. I think the other point about Muggeridge's review is, I think let's not forget, I mean, Muggeridge gave AP his job at Punch and was effectively his boss and senior in the relationship. And I think as AP's reputation grew as a novelist, I think then fits in with this undercurrent of jealousy around, he is succeeding and going past me. And those who succeed in television, I think, generally feel somehow they've failed. As a man of letters, they've ended up in the sort of TV world. And I think you're right that sort of jealousy was an undercurrent there of that review. Thank you.
Yeah, I do also wonder if Muggeridge was somewhere on the autistic spectrum and wouldn't have, as you suggest, Jeff, wouldn't have even thought about the implications of that review, or indeed anything much he wrote. Comments? Anybody? Did I see Cheryl with a hand up? Yes. Cheryl, you're on mute.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, I wanted to thank Jeff for illuminating what was always somewhat puzzling to me to figure out sort of who shot John, where each person stood. But the way you triangulated that also with the Waugh friendship was also, I thought, very original, and I appreciated that a great deal. It also reminded me of the fact that all writers are extremely delicate creatures. And they really take offense very easily because that's where their soul is.
Yeah.
And, it's quite typical. So thank you.
Good point.
Yes, thank you, Jeff. Anybody else? If you're waving your hand, I can't see you. So, no?
No.
Elwyn again.
One again, yeah.
Yeah, actually, it was just a detail, really. And on the photograph that you show as being Oberon Herbert, in fact, that's a photograph of his father, Aubrey Herbert.
Ah, okay.
I think it's the wrong one. The famous man who is Greenmantle.
Ah, yes, that's right, yes.
Okay, Colin. You're on mute, Colin.
Beg your pardon. Just to come back to writers being sensitive people, I seem to recall that Auburn Wall launched a fairly heavy broadside against AP. Was it in the 80s? And that he took that fairly badly. I don't recall the details, but I do seem to remember Private Eye, or Bron Wall using Private Eye as a mechanism for that.
Yes, although what really set him off was in the 90s when Wall was picking up a job as a book reviewer at the Sunday Telegraph, and he wrote a very negative review of Powell's collected essays and articles. And what infuriated Powell was that disappeared in the Daily Telegraph, where he was still the chief book reviewer on the daily edition. So he was so angry he quit. Although he probably wasn't that far from doing that anyway. But that's the flap with Oberon, another failed novelist, as we may know, who turned into a journalist. So there probably is some overlap there.
Yeah. Thanks. I'd forgotten that.
And there was an awful lot of enmity, continued between the Wars and the Poles as a result. And in fact, there was a lot of enmity between Pole and Max Hastings, who was the literary editor of the Telegraph at the time, and who I think actually was out of the country, but was certainly nobody had thought to sort of stop War from writing.
Well, Wall was a pretty cantankerous character.
Yeah. Paul.
Yeah, just a comment that when Alexander Waugh talked to us at the Travellers Club, he mentioned his view that this all went back to when Auburn Waugh was looking for some help to get going in the literary world, and AP basically said, no, you've got to make it on your own merits, and refused to sort of give him a helping hand, so to speak. And that was part of it, he thinks, that led to the enmity from Auburn Waugh towards AP. John Blackster.
John Blackster. You're on mute, John. John, you're on mute.
That's done it, right.
That's better.
Is that now? Yes, okay.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was going to say that the Alexander Waugh talk was very good in that. And certainly Oberon thought that as his father had always maintained, respect in print for Powell's work, then this ought to have been reciprocated, and he ought to have been given a bit of a push with with his early novels. But that's what Paul was saying. It's a very good talk, actually, that one. Unfortunately, not available in print.
No, I know Stephen Walker wanted to print it, and we've never, or he's never managed to get a manuscript out of War.
I think actually, and again, very minor points, but was it Nicholas Shakespeare who actually was in charge because Hastings was abroad or on holiday or something? time. So he also got some blame for allowing this to go. You know,
Hastings was certainly involved in it somewhere. I forget exactly where.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anybody else?
So Keith, if there's nobody else, we're just about out of time.
Yeah.
Can I just, on everybody's behalf, thank Jeff again for highlighting this aspect of AP's life and a very important relationship for him with Muggeridge. And just to remind everybody, we've got 2 Zoom calls coming up in June. The 2022 virtual conference talk in June on the Ufford Hotel by June Lawrenson. And there's also a social Zoom call as well. So the details of those are both on the website. So just to say thanks to Jeff again, thanks to Keith for arranging and hosting, sending all the details out, and look forward to seeing all of you, I hope, in June.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Paul.
Cheers then.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.